What's happening, folks? Back with the next piece in our fourth day of classical days. Thank you to all those who are taking the journeys with me, and to Michaela, who's been commenting on nearly all of the reactions. I really do appreciate that. And we're going to listen to another piece that plays a prominent role in Nodame Cantabile. Again, my love of classical music goes back to my wee tot days when I was 4 or 5 years old, and I started to hear a lot of classical music in my parents' household, especially from my dad. I became even more interested in classical music in my very late teens and early 20s, and that was just sort of on my own. I started listening to some of the CDs I already had, and that made me really dive into it and go buy a bunch of more CDs, which is where a lot of my Naxos and Amadeus CDs come from. That period, the shop that I went to had a lot of those two classical music labels. In any case, a few years later, there was an even more classical music enhancing experience I had, which was watching Nodame, which came out in the mid-2000s. And as I said, even if you've never watched a minute of J-drama in your life, I encourage you to check it out. I'll put a link to my full watch-along on Patreon of the show, and you can check it out for yourself, but it really is worthwhile if you like classical music. In any case, we're going to listen to the first symphony from Johannes Brahms. Brahms was a German composer. He lived in what I think is technically like the mid-Romantic period, and indeed, this work is famous for having taken him 20 years to complete, and there were early drafts that he threw away, and he was very frustrated. I think he actually was dealing with some mental illness. These issues are all talked about in multiple episodes of Nodame, but one in particular. But the point is, he actually felt the weight of Beethoven's significance, and he felt he had to create a symphony that had the same intellectual and technical quality, and so that was part of why it took him so long to finally get this symphony to a point where it would become the famous work that it has since become. So yes, it took him 20 years to complete. It wasn't until the mid-1870s that he finally finished it in the way we know it today. And we're going to listen to, once again, the Berlin Philharmonic as conducted by Herbert von Karajan. So it is another sign of quality when you hear those names. Let's give it a listen. This is Johannes Brahms' First Symphony, the first movement, which is un poco It's sostenuto, allegro, and then meno, allegro. So yes, it's got a lot of different musical directions. It is quite a long movement. It's over 13 minutes long, so let's get to it. This is the first movement of Brahms' First Symphony, as performed by the Berlin Philharmonic and conducted by Herbert von Karajan. It's like a real live performance, like waiting to cough or clear your voice. And indeed, I sort of like choked on some tea a couple minutes into that. I had to try to manage my affairs without disrupting the performance. So yes, it's an incredible first movement. In Nodame, the symphony as a whole is cast by Chiaki, who is one of the main characters, studying to be a conductor and very much knowledgeable and erudite about composers and music. He talks about the long period of composition for this, Brahms' mental difficulties during that time, and he casts the symphony overall as a journey from despair to hope, which it absolutely is, and he primarily speaks about the first movement as indicative of the heavy mental anguish and despair that Brahms felt, and the fourth movement with liberation from that and joyous triumph over those difficulties, which it is that, but I think you can hear some hints at the yearning for that triumph, for the journey to hope, even in this first movement, despite the opening and multiple parts along the way feeling heavy and clouded and difficult with challenges being faced. I will say, though, that heavy, dark opening, one of my favorite first 20 seconds or so of any symphony, and I'm going to do another symphony this morning, which will be a nice comparison, and I will again pose the question to you listeners, which one starts more dramatically in that regard? And of course, there's a reason I spoke about Beethoven in the intro in terms of Brahms and his expectation and his ambitions. So yes, it is a symphony from Beethoven that will be coming. But yes, this opening movement is incredible. It's heavy, it's powerful, though again with some hints of a yearning for lighter mental experience and emotion. So yeah, I very much enjoyed it, and I'll be right back with the second movement. Peace.